Ed Sullivan revealed the 7 music legends who were actually evil. The Ed Sullivan Show brought America's living rooms the greatest musical talents of a generation. Every Sunday night, families gathered around their television sets to watch the parade of stars Sullivan had personally selected to entertain the nation. His stamp of approval could launch careers into the stratosphere. But behind Sullivan's famously stiff demeanor and awkward introductions lay a shrewd judge of character. While millions saw only the carefully staged performances, Sullivan witnessed what happened when the cameras stopped rolling, the true nature of these musical icons when they thought no one was watching. Ed ran a family show, revealed a longtime producer who worked closely with Sullivan. He had an almost pathological concern with protecting his audience from anything he considered inappropriate or harmful. This wasn't just about censoring lyrics or dance moves. It was about the character of the performers themselves. In private conversations with close associates, and in personal notes discovered years after his death, Sullivan expressed deep concerns about certain musicians whose talents he admired, but whose personal conduct he found disturbing, or even dangerous. These weren't just stars with bad attitudes or demanding riders. These were performers Sullivan came to believe harbored genuine darkness beneath their public personas. Tonight, we reveal the 7 music legends who Sullivan privately described as actually evil, talented artists whose musical contributions are undeniable, but whose personal conduct ranged from troubling to criminal, from exploitative to violent. These aren't just tales of rock and roll excess, but disturbing patterns that Sullivan recognized early and tried in his own way to shield his audience from. But first, we begin with perhaps the most shocking case, a founding father of rock and roll whose talent was matched only by the scandal that would temporarily destroy his career and the troubling allegations that would follow him for decades. The piano prodigy who married his 13-year-old cousin. When Sullivan discovered the truth about Jerry Lee Lewis, he didn't just cancel his next appearance, he blacklisted him for life. And that was before the mysterious deaths began.
From Faraday, Louisiana, Jerry Lee Lewis.
1. Jerry Lee Lewis, the killer's darkest secret. When Jerry Lee Lewis took the stage on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1957, he was the very embodiment of rock and roll's dangerous energy. His pounding piano style, wild performance antics, and songs like Whole Lotta Shakin' Goin' On and Great Balls of Fire had earned him the nickname The Killer and positioned him as a potential rival to Elvis Presley for the crown of rock's greatest star. Less than a year later, Lewis's meteoric rise came crashing down when the British press discovered the shocking truth during his UK tour. The 22-year-old Lewis had married his 13-year-old cousin, Myra Gale Brown. Making matters worse, Lewis had lied about her age, claiming she was 15, still scandalously young, but less obviously criminal. Sullivan was furious. He never invited him back, revealed a booking agent who worked with the show during this period. Ed had put his personal stamp of approval on Lewis by featuring him prominently. When the marriage scandal broke, Sullivan felt personally betrayed. He believed Lewis had made him complicit in promoting someone who would do something Sullivan considered fundamentally immoral. Lewis's career in America immediately collapsed. Radio stations stopped playing his records, venues canceled his concerts, and his appearance fees plummeted from $10,000 per night to $250. While he would eventually rebuild his career in country music, the scandal permanently derailed his trajectory as a mainstream rock and roll pioneer. What Sullivan couldn't have known at the time, but what would gradually emerge over the following decades, was that the Myra Gale Brown scandal was just the beginning of Lewis's troubling history with women. His 7 marriages would be marked by allegations of physical abuse, and 2 of his wives died under circumstances that raised questions. His 4th wife, Jaren Gunn Lewis, drowned in a swimming pool shortly before their divorce was finalized, and his 5th wife, Shawn Michelle Stevens, died of a methadone overdose just 77 days after their wedding. Sullivan had a 6th sense about performers with dangerous tendencies, noted a television historian who studied Sullivan's career. His refusal to have Lewis back wasn't just about the scandal itself, but about what Sullivan perceived as a fundamental character flaw. Time would prove that instinct correct as Lewis's life became marked by violence, substance abuse, and tragedy. While Lewis remained a towering musical influence whose piano style and unbridled performance energy shaped rock and roll, Sullivan's early recognition of his troubling personal conduct represented one of the host's most significant stands against a major talent on moral grounds. James Brown dazzled audiences with his electric performances, But backstage, Sullivan witnessed a different man entirely. "That man has a devil inside him," Sullivan confided to his producer. The godfather of soul's violent rap sheet would prove Sullivan right.
So we are delighted to present James Brown on our stage on this show. So let's have a fine welcome for our very fine talent.
2. James Brown, The Godfather's Dark Kingdom. James Brown revolutionized American music with his dynamic performances, pioneering funk sound, and unmatched work ethic. When he appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, his electrifying stage presence and precision-drilled band delivered performances so powerful that Sullivan, not known for effusive praise, called him the hardest-working man in show business, a nickname that stuck throughout Brown's career. Behind the sequined jumpsuits and cape flourishes, however, lurked a man whose behavior offstage revealed a disturbing pattern of violence, control, and criminality that Sullivan reportedly found deeply troubling. "He made crowds scream, and women fear him," said a former associate who worked backstage during several of Brown's Sullivan appearances. Ed was old-school entertainment. He believed stars should be grateful, humble, and professional. Brown was none of those things. He demanded absolute control, treated his band like servants, and had a god complex that Sullivan found disturbing. Brown's criminal history began before fame and continued throughout his career. His rap sheet included multiple arrests for domestic violence against different wives and girlfriends, weapons charges, and drug possession. His volatile temper and controlling behavior became legendary in the music industry, with band members subjected to harsh fines for minor infractions like scuffed shoes or missed dance steps. Sullivan allegedly said Brown had a devil's energy in him, recalled a production assistant who overheard a conversation between Sullivan and his producer. He respected Brown's talent enormously, but was disturbed by the stories that circulated about his treatment of women and his band members. There was something in Brown that Sullivan found genuinely concerning beyond typical star behavior. Perhaps most disturbing were the allegations of domestic abuse that followed Brown throughout his life. Multiple wives and girlfriends came forward with stories of brutal beatings, including his third wife, Adrienne Lois Rodriguez, who filed for divorce and multiple assault charges against him, then reconciled, only to die under somewhat mysterious circumstances in 1996 following cosmetic surgery. While Sullivan continued to book Brown due to his undeniable talent and audience appeal, staff members recalled that Sullivan maintained a professional distance from the performer that differed markedly from his warm relationships with other regular guests. "Sullivan was trapped in a dilemma with Brown," explained a music historian. "He couldn't deny Brown's cultural importance and musical genius, but he was deeply uncomfortable with aspects of his character. It created a strange dynamic where Sullivan would praise Brown's performances effusively on air while expressing private reservations about the man himself. Brown's musical legacy remains secure. His innovations shaped funk, soul, disco, and later hip-hop through extensive sampling of his work. But Sullivan's early recognition of the troubling aspects of Brown's personality proved prescient as allegations and criminal charges accumulated throughout the performer's life. Chuck Berry created rock and roll as we know it, and a criminal record so disturbing that Sullivan vowed never to book him again. One performance was all it took for Sullivan to see what Berry's adoring fans couldn't.
Let's turn him loose. Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Berry, Sweet Little 16.
3. Chuck Berry, rock's pioneer with a prison record. When Chuck Berry performed Maybelline on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1955, he was introducing America to a new sound that would help define rock and roll for generations to come. His distinctive guitar style, charismatic stage presence, and storytelling lyrics about teenage life revolutionized popular music and influenced everyone from the Beatles to the Rolling Stones. Sullivan initially embraced Berry as an exciting new talent, but their relationship reportedly soured as details of Berry's criminal history and ongoing legal troubles became increasingly difficult to ignore. Sullivan booked him once and regretted it forever, claimed a staff writer who worked on The Ed Sullivan Show during this period. Berry was brilliant on camera, but Sullivan was horrified when he learned more about Berry's past and his ongoing legal issues. It created a real conflict for Ed, who believed in second chances, but also felt responsible for who he presented to American families. Berry's troubled history began before fame, with a 1944 armed robbery conviction that sent him to a reformatory until age 21. His most serious legal issue came in 1959 when he was arrested for violating the Mann Act, transporting a 14-year-old girl across state lines for immoral purposes. The girl had been working as a hat-check girl at Barry's club, and he had allegedly brought her to St. Louis to work at his bandstand. Barry was eventually convicted and served 20 months in prison. This conviction occurred during the height of Barry's popularity, creating a significant problem for Sullivan, who prided himself on presenting performers who upheld certain moral standards. While Barry would eventually return to performing after his release, his relationship with Sullivan's show was permanently damaged. Chuck Berry was a musical genius, but Sullivan couldn't reconcile that with Barry's criminal behavior, explained a cultural historian who studied early rock and roll television appearances. Sullivan was willing to forgive certain transgressions, but crimes involving minors crossed a line he wasn't willing to ignore, no matter how talented the performer. Barry's legal troubles continued throughout his career, including tax evasion charges, and most disturbingly, a 1990 class action lawsuit from women who alleged they had been videotaped in the bathroom of a restaurant Barry owned. He eventually settled the lawsuit for a reported $1.2 million. What makes Barry's case particularly complex is the undeniable impact of his music contrasted with his troubling personal conduct. His innovative guitar work, distinctive sound, and compositions like Johnny B., Good, Roll Over Beethoven, and rock and roll music literally defined rock music and influenced generations of musicians who followed. Sullivan was caught in the difficult position of recognizing Barry's revolutionary musical contributions while being deeply troubled by his personal conduct, noted the historian. It represented one of the earliest examples of the separation of art from artist that continues to challenge the entertainment industry today. Sullivan famously refused to show Elvis's hips on television. The real reason? Not the dancing, but what Sullivan called a disturbing pattern with young female fans that left him deeply concerned about the king's private appetites.
Peace in the Valley. Here is Elvis Presley.
4. Elvis Presley, the King's Controversial Court. Elvis Presley's appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956 and 1957 remain among the most famous moments in television history. Performances so electrifying that they helped transform American popular culture overnight. Sullivan initially refused to book Presley due to concerns about his provocative performance style, only relenting after competing programs featured him to massive ratings. Sullivan's decision to censor Presley by filming him only from the waist up during his final appearance has become legendary. A moment that perfectly captured the generational divide between post-war youth culture and the established entertainment guardians. Sullivan saw the worship and feared the man behind it, said a former Sullivan staff member. What people don't realize is that Sullivan's concerns about Elvis went beyond the hip swinging. Ed was genuinely worried about the almost religious devotion Elvis inspired in young people, especially girls. He thought there was something unhealthy about it, something potentially exploitative. Sullivan's unease about Presley's influence represents one of his more controversial judgments. Unlike others on this list, Elvis had no known criminal record or documented cases of abuse. However, retrospective examinations of Presley's relationships have raised questions about certain patterns in his personal life. Most notably, Priscilla Beaulieu began her relationship with Elvis when she was just 14 years old, and he was 24. Though they didn't marry until she was 21, Priscilla later revealed that their relationship included controlling behavior, with Elvis shaping everything from her appearance to her movements. Additionally, biographers have documented Presley's apparent preference for very young, virginal women whom he could mold to his specifications. Sullivan wasn't privy to the details of Elvis's private life, but he sensed something in the dynamic between Elvis and his young female fans that troubled him, explained a cultural historian. It wasn't just moral panic about rock and roll. It was concern about the power imbalance between an adult male star and the teenage girls who idolized him. What makes Sullivan's judgment of Elvis particularly interesting is how it evolved over time. After initially resisting booking Presley, then censoring his performances, Sullivan eventually praised Elvis publicly, telling the audience after one performance, "This is a real decent, fine boy." This public endorsement came as Presley's management worked to soften his image, suggesting that Sullivan's concerns were partially addressed by the careful image control implemented by Colonel Tom Parker, Presley's manager. However, staff members reported that Sullivan maintained private reservations about Elvis's influence on youth culture. Elvis remains a complicated case on Sullivan's list, noted the historian. Unlike the others, there's no clear criminal behavior or documented abuse, But Sullivan's concerns about the power dynamics between adult male performers and young female fans raised questions that the entertainment industry continues to grapple with today. While audiences enjoyed Phil Spector's wall of sound, Sullivan warned his staff, "Keep that man off my show." Decades before Spector murdered an actress in his mansion, Sullivan had already identified him as genuinely dangerous. Five. Phil Spector, the sound of genius and madness. Phil Spector never appeared as a performer on The Ed Sullivan Show, but his musical influence was inescapable throughout the 1960s. As the creator of the wall of sound production technique and the driving force behind hits for groups like the Ronettes, the Crystals, and the Righteous Brothers, Spector revolutionized pop music production and shaped the soundtrack of a generation. Behind that musical genius, however, lurked increasingly disturbing behavior that would eventually culminate in murder, a tragic outcome that Sullivan reportedly anticipated decades before it occurred. He shaped sound and shattered lives, observed a music industry veteran who worked with both Sullivan and Spector during the 1960s. Sullivan refused to have Spector on as a guest despite his enormous influence. He said there was something deeply wrong with Spector, something that went beyond typical show business eccentricity or arrogance. Sullivan's concerns about Spector were reportedly sparked by accounts of the producer's controlling behavior in the studio and his disturbing treatment of artists, particularly female singers. Ronnie Spector, lead singer of the Ronettes and later Phil's wife, would eventually reveal that her husband kept her virtually imprisoned in their mansion, threatening to kill her if she left him. Sullivan reportedly despised his arrogance and refused to feature him directly, said a booking agent who worked with the show. Acts produced by Spector would appear, but Sullivan deliberately avoided giving Spector personal attention or credit. This wasn't just professional jealousy. Sullivan genuinely believed Spector was dangerous and didn't want to elevate him personally. What makes Sullivan's assessment of Spector particularly prescient was how accurately it predicted the producer's eventual downfall. As Spector's behavior grew increasingly erratic and threatening through the 1970s and beyond, stories emerged about him pulling guns on artists including John Lennon, Leonard Cohen, and the Ramones during recording sessions. This volatile behavior culminated in the 2003 shooting death of actress Lana Clarkson at Spector's mansion, a crime for which he was eventually convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 19 years to life in prison, where he died in 2021. Sullivan had an almost uncanny ability to sense genuine darkness in certain performers, noted a television historian. His concerns about Spector went beyond disliking his personality or professional conduct. Sullivan seemed to recognize something fundamentally disturbed in Spector decades before it became impossible for the rest of the world to ignore. The Spector case represents perhaps the most extreme validation of Sullivan's judgments about performers' character. The musical genius who created some of the most uplifting, emotionally resonant pop music of all time eventually revealed himself to be capable of the ultimate violence, exactly as Sullivan had apparently feared decades earlier. Ike and Tina Turner brought the house down, but Sullivan noticed something chilling: how Ike watched Tina's every move. Behind the perfect choreography, Sullivan recognized the signs of abuse years before Tina's escape made headlines. 6. Ike Turner, the architect of musical and personal terror. Ike and Tina Turner brought explosive energy to The Ed Sullivan Show with performances that showcased both Tina's dynamic stage presence and Ike's tight musical direction. Their rendition of Creedence Clearwater Revival's Proud Mary remains one of the most electrifying performances in the show's history, demonstrating why they were considered one of music's most powerful live acts. Behind the coordinated stage show and musical precision, however, lurked one of music's most notorious cases of abuse and control, a situation that Sullivan reportedly recognized early and found deeply disturbing. On stage, it was electric. Off stage, it was hell, said a stage manager who worked multiple Ike and Tina Turner appearances on the show. Sullivan wasn't easily fooled by image. He saw how Ike controlled everything: the band, the Ikettes, and especially Tina. The way Ike watched her every move gave Sullivan concerns almost immediately. According to staff accounts, Sullivan developed a warm relationship with Tina, while maintaining a noticeably cool professional distance from Ike. This wasn't just personal preference, but reportedly stemmed from what Sullivan observed backstage and heard from industry contacts about Ike's treatment of his wife and performers. Ed loved Tina, but Ike's violence, control, and cocaine-fueled rages disgusted him, revealed a production assistant who worked on several of their appearances. Sullivan would go out of his way to compliment Tina directly, deliberately bypassing Ike, which was practically unheard of given Ike's controlling nature. It was Sullivan's subtle way of acknowledging what he believed was happening behind closed doors. What Sullivan apparently sensed became public knowledge years later, when Tina finally escaped the relationship in 1976 and eventually revealed the full horror of her marriage in her autobiography, I, Tina, and the subsequent film, What's Love Got to Do with It? Tina described enduring years of severe physical abuse, being forced to perform while injured, and living in constant fear for her life. Sullivan booked them early on, but sources say he kept his distance from Ike, explained a music historian. This wasn't just personal dislike, but genuine moral judgment. Sullivan believed that Ike's treatment of Tina and others in his orbit crossed a line from difficult personality into something truly evil. Ike Turner's musical contributions remain significant. Many music historians credit his 1951 recording Rocket 88 as the first rock and roll record, and his tight band direction created a distinctive sound that influenced countless performers. However, these achievements have been permanently overshadowed by his documented abuse and control of Tina and others in his orbit. Sullivan's dilemma with Ike and Tina demonstrates the complex moral calculations behind his booking decisions, noted a television historian. He continued featuring the act because of their undeniable talent and Tina's star quality, but he made his disapproval of Ike clear in subtle ways that industry insiders recognized, even while maintaining the professional courtesy his show was known for. One word, one broken promise. The night Jim Morrison deliberately defied Sullivan on live television didn't just end with a ban. It confirmed Sullivan's suspicion that Morrison's self-destruction would eventually consume him completely. 7. Jim Morrison, the poet who defied America's host. The Doors' 1967 appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show was supposed to be a crowning moment for the rising psychedelic rock band. Instead, it became one of the most notorious incidents in the program's history and earned the group the rare distinction of being permanently banned from television's most important music showcase. The conflict centered on the band's hit song Light My Fire, and specifically the line, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher." Sullivan, concerned about drug references on his family program, personally asked Morrison to change the lyric to "Girl, we couldn't get much better" for the live broadcast, a request Morrison agreed to backstage. When the cameras rolled, however, Morrison defiantly sang the original lyrics, making direct eye contact with the camera as he delivered the word "higher." It was a deliberate act of rebellion that Sullivan interpreted not just as professional discourtesy, but as a personal betrayal. One lyric, one act of defiance, total blackout, summarized a producer who witnessed the aftermath. Sullivan was livid. When the performance ended, he refused to shake their hands, something he almost never did with guests. Backstage, he told their producer, "You will never do the Sullivan Show again," and they never did. Unlike some conflicts that stemmed from Sullivan's concerns about performers' off-camera behavior, the break with Morrison happened in full view of the television audience. It represented a direct challenge to Sullivan's authority on his own program, something the host found unforgivable. Sullivan banned the Doors for life, called Morrison a walking ego trip on acid, revealed a booking agent who worked with the show. It wasn't just about the lyric itself. Sullivan believed Morrison had looked him in the eye, made a promise, and then deliberately broke it on live television specifically to undermine him. He saw it as a character issue, not just a creative disagreement. Morrison's defiance came during a period of increasing unpredictability in both his personal and professional life. His alcohol consumption was becoming problematic, his behavior increasingly erratic, and his performances more volatile. Within a few years, these tendencies would lead to the infamous Miami incident, where Morrison was arrested for allegedly exposing himself during a chaotic performance, a charge that remained controversial and contested. Sullivan's judgment of Morrison went beyond the higher incident, explained a cultural historian who studied the relationship between rock musicians and television. He apparently told his staff that Morrison had something destructive in him that goes beyond typical rock rebellion. Sullivan seemed to sense that Morrison's self-destructive tendencies weren't just artistic temperament, but something darker. This assessment proved tragically accurate as Morrison's downward spiral accelerated in the following years. His substance abuse worsened, his behavior became more unpredictable, and his artistic output suffered. Morrison died in Paris in 1971 at age 27, becoming one of rock's most iconic tragic figures. The Doors incident exemplifies how Sullivan's judgments about performers weren't always based on criminal behavior or hidden misconduct, but sometimes on what he perceived as fundamental character flaws revealed in professional interactions. Morrison's willingness to break his word on live television struck Sullivan as evidence of a deeper moral failing that justified permanent exclusion from his platform. The Sullivan Standard: What His Judgments Reveal. Ed Sullivan's private assessments of these 7 musical legends reveal something important about both the man himself and the era he represented. Unlike today's fragmented media landscape, Sullivan served as America's primary cultural gatekeeper for nearly 2 decades, determining which performers deserved the massive exposure his program provided and which would be denied access to millions of living rooms each Sunday night. Sullivan's judgments were never purely about talent. He regularly featured performers with limited abilities but solid professional reputations, while occasionally restricting or banning genuinely innovative artists whose personal conduct he found troubling. This wasn't arbitrary moralizing, but reflected Sullivan's deeply held belief that with cultural influence came responsibility, particularly when that influence affected young people. Sullivan saw himself as having a contract with American families, explained a television historian who studied Sullivan's career. He believed they trusted him to bring entertainers into their homes who, whatever their artistic styles, possessed basic decency as human beings. When he discovered behavior that violated that standard, he took it personally, not just as a professional misjudgment, but as a breach of trust with his audience. What makes Sullivan's assessments particularly interesting is how often they proved prescient. His early concerns about figures like Phil Spector, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Ike Turner identified troubling behavioral patterns that would later become impossible to ignore. While some might attribute this to conservative bias against rock and roll's inherent rebellion, Sullivan happily featured numerous rock acts whose backstage behavior met his standards of professionalism. Sullivan's era represented a fundamentally different relationship between media and celebrity morality. Without social media to instantly expose misconduct, and with powerful studio publicity departments controlling stars' public images, Sullivan's behind-the-scenes access gave him insights into performers' true characters that the general public often lacked. Sullivan wasn't always right in his judgments, and by contemporary standards, some of his moral boundaries seem outdated, noted a cultural critic. But he took seriously the responsibility that came with his platform at a time when television exerted enormous influence on American culture. His concern wasn't just about protecting his show's reputation, but about the cumulative impact these performers had on society. The passage of time has complicated our view of these 7 musical figures. Their artistic contributions remain undeniable. They created sounds, styles, and songs that fundamentally shaped popular music. Yet their personal conduct, ranging from troubling to criminal, forces us to confront difficult questions about separating art from artist and about how we memorialize complicated cultural figures. Sullivan himself never fully resolved this tension. He continued featuring certain performers despite personal reservations, while banning others for behavior he found inexcusable. These inconsistencies weren't hypocrisy, but reflected the complex moral calculations involved in his role as America's most influential cultural curator. In today's world of algorithm-driven content and fragmented media, Sullivan's role seems almost unimaginable, concluded the historian. One man making weekly decisions about which performers deserve national exposure based not just on talent but on character. His judgments, whether we agree with them or not, force us to consider questions that remain relevant. What responsibilities do platforms have regarding the artists they promote? How do we weigh artistic brilliance against personal misconduct? And ultimately, how much should character matter in our assessment of cultural figures? Thank you for watching this exploration of Ed Sullivan's private judgments about music's most controversial legends. If you found this journey through television's golden age revealing, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into entertainment history's most fascinating untold stories. Next week, we'll uncover the beloved family sitcoms of the 1960s that concealed dark realities behind their perfect on-screen families.